Yes, you're audible.
Okay, I take POI by unmuting yourself. Fair warning, I would probably only take POIs from opposing opposition. So to distinguish yourself, please say POI CO. Thank you. Start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, this debate should recognize that there is a change in the interpretation because that is factual, that is recognized by the adjudication court in the context slide. Sure. The debate should then be about what is more strategic for the Christian church, whether to admit that change or to play stupid and deny those changes exist, right? Sure. Our mechanism is we're going to actively recognize, right? It means that in our sermons and preachings, we're going to distinguish ourselves with past teachings. We're going to explain what past teachings are not relevant anymore. We're going to explain why the current dogmas are better. We're going to admit that there was a mistake in interpreting Jesus as a rebellious revolutionary, for example, and that he should be portrayed as peaceful. And we will follow that with reasonings, right? In my speech, I'm going to talk about several things. First of all, I'm going to talk about the problem when we are inconsistent without a reason. Second of all, I'm going to talk about why it's important because it is consistent with religious teaching. And third of all, why alternatively our side will be much better. First, what is the problem in the debate, right? We think that when we admit that there are already dogmas that are changing, and you don't want to explain that these reasoning exist and that these dogmas are changing, they will be seen as inconsistent without a reason, right? That's why there are a lot of infighting amongst people who latch on to old interpretation and thinks that the old interpretation is better or the old interpretation is good, and the newer interpretations are just people who are giving ajaran sesat, for example, and that they shouldn't be followed. We think that the interpretation that we're debating about is not just as trivial as circumcision, but also whether we should accept LGBT community in churches, for example, whether or not we should allow whether or not we should treat other people who are agnostic as with hostility, for example, is these humanities that are changing in the dogmas, right? Why is this bad? First of all, the reason why the community is so angry and why there is a lot of fight between the people who believed in the newer interpretation and those in the old interpretation is because they don't get closure, right? They don't understand why there are people arbitrarily deciding that the interpretation changes. There's no explanation why there are some people who come up with a newer interpretation and there's no justification why. This is very different with Catholic churches, right? Remember the motion saturation churches, because Catholic churches were there with a hierarchy where there's the Pope or the Vatican who gets to revisit the interpretation and make a very public announcement what they think of the new dogmas and give a reasoning of the new dogma, just like how Pope Francis said that LGBT should be accepted, right? It's different with Christian churches that has different churches and different that don't have like a hierarchy central leader for them, and they feel like these people don't deserve to make interpretations and they don't know which interpretation to follow, right? And that's why there are a lot of infighting. But the second reason why this is bad is because it shuns people, especially the minority, who feels like they have to choose between their identity and their spirituality, right? We're talking about LGBT people who are excluded from churches and don't think that they deserve a spot in churches. We're talking about other people who don't want to treat their agnostic friends with hostility, for example. So even if they've already felt embraced by the religion and leaders of the community, the rest of the community, the people in that congregation, are still reluctant for fear of following ajaran sesat, and that's why they will continue treating these minorities with hostility, right? And that's why we think that this entire thing is bad. So where do we come in? We think this is important for us to explain that we are different from the past because it is actually consistent with religious teaching, right? First of all, because we need to normalize that interpretation is never certain, because God is a one perfect being, but humans can make mistakes, including in interpreting what God says. The Christian churches admitting that what they did in the past was wrong and saying that there is a newer interpretation that is good shows that we agree that God is perfect, but we make these people understand that you treating other people with hostility is not a certainty that you're right, and you always need to reevaluate yourself in order to serve the one perfect God. But the second reason why this is consistent with religious teaching is because the trend in religion has always been changing slowly to becoming more and more peaceful. Jesus, for example, in the New Testament, actively called out the Old Testament for being vengeful. He called out God's methods in calling the Noah's flood and Sodom and Gomorrah and eye for an eye law. He actively teaches that you need to forgive continuously and you shouldn't treat others with violence, even though these people are treating you with hostility, right? in the modern world, we also see this consistency, right? Jesus, as an interpretation, becoming a more peaceful carpenter, abandoning the rebellious notion that portrays Jesus as an angry man. That's because religion is always always going through an evolution where they always portray religion as more and more peaceful as time goes, and that's why we think that this is consistent. So why alternatively in our side of the house? What we're going to mechanize our proposal and explain what kind of reasoning and justification we're going to offer and why that is better, right? We think that we can turn the changing of dogma into a very inspiring story. So why do Jesus become more peaceful, for example? The reason why Jesus is portrayed as a rebellious revolutionary was because he got extremely mad when church is used as a market, for example, and he got really angry and he turned a lot of tables upside down, for example. It was reinterpreted by saying that Jesus is actually a peaceful carpenter, and the reason why he got so angry is because he's 100% human, that he's also like us, and he can also have weaknesses. The reason why this is important, because when you are able to control the narrative and you need to explain why we interpret Jesus as a peaceful carpenter, regardless of him throwing wrath in that church, is because people can see this as a good thing. One, people can see that Jesus is also human, that he can get angry, but he can turn to the Almighty Father when he is weak. And that is also the same with us, where we can also get angry and we have our own weaknesses. But if we follow what the church tells us to do, we are able to follow the Almighty God. But the second reason why this can be a good thing when we control the narrative is because the people now feel like I'm closer to God now because I understand Jesus better. We think that the newer interpretation, when it is coupled with a justification or with a logical reasoning, makes people believe that they understand religion better, and so it's not that they only accept the interpretation, but they also feel like they're more spiritual than before because now they understand what God really wants them to know. So what is the comparison in their side of the house, right? We understand that the opposition bench might have concerns that we might be seen as wishy-washy or not having a certain or not having a certainty or not having a good enough guide, and a lot of people will lose trust in the system, for example. But we think that in their side of the house, that's going to happen anyway, because it's a given, right? That church will always have changing interpretation, and that there will always be people who fix the old interpretation. Even the Pope does that. Even the religious leaders does that. We think that at least in our side of the house, we don't let other people who don't understand about the interpretations control their narrative and say that this is something and use reasoning that doesn't actually make sense, making people more confused about the interpretation. At least in our side of the house, we let the religious leaders who actually know what they're talking about control the narrative and give a sacred justification as to why this interpretation is actually the interpretation that God.
Okay, thank you very much for Prime Minister to respond to this and open the debate in opposition side of the House. Please welcome the opposition.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Wait a minute. Okay, I'm gonna set my timer. Okay. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The reason that in the past church have the interest to change is because there's a constant threatness to our church. They say that how, for example, how like Jesus the crucified and like the interpretation that Jesus is rebellious, it doesn't appeal to Roman. So that's why that Roman are more prefer that the interpretation of Jesus, the guy, lovely person that love everyone. We think that currently we don't have certain threats currently, and no the urgency to change our moral compass. With us church, we think we don't have any urgency. We're going to stick to our moral compass and stick to our conservative interpretation from the past. So how the OO stands? We say as OO, we won't recognize these new dogmas such as like how currently circumcised is not obliged, or how certain like new dogmas that are being interpreted in the new modern way. We think that we're not going to we're not going to recognize that. We say that the only interpretation that are right and the only interpretation is that in the past that we say that church is something that original. We don't have the urgency to evolving as what the OOC, as what the OGC. So before I'm proving why that exactly evolving is something not important, I'm going to debunk the OG cases. Because simply OG only talks about two things. Right? First, how like the first one is how the human is imperfect, like how like the church itself should also like acknowledge this. We think that this debate should talking about the view of the church itself. Like so, we think that in the church, I don't see why the narrative or the urgency why we should see, we should project this kind of imperfection of us as church itself, because we say that however even like the interpretation might be wrong at certain points, but we think that the firstly how that the interpretation is already been discussed well in the past by many gereja, and how that we think that there's much of deliberation. But even if it's not is wrong interpretation, we think that as church we shouldn't just like admit that we are imperfect, because at the end of the day, like the only reason why people go to church, the only reason why people do salvation to this certain pope is because they trust this person as someone that can give certain compass. We think that how in the moment when we lose that, because simply we just want to acknowledge this imperfect, we think that the church is will be nonsense at the end of the day. But secondly, when they say about how like it creates more peaceful interpretation, I think that even though like perhaps currently there are certain like more peaceful interpretation, but I think like in practical there are still people that don't there are still people that conflicted toward this many interpretation that they create. So even like there's new interpretation, the multi-interpretation that currently happen in the practices is what creates like many chaos, tension between members of the Christian. We think that as just that obliged to give the certain peaceful or certain stability, we think that we don't think like that's just because the new interpretation is good. We should apply or should subscribe to that. So I'm going to what I'm going to prove to you as all. As all, I'm going to prove to you why the image of church as evolving institution is bad for the church itself, and it's not something that should be the main agenda of Christian church. Two things to say. First, we say that it going to loses the sanctity of the church itself, because notice that the characterizations of church and characterization of religions is that people go do these certain salvations and to certain preaching that are always going to be constant. The notion is that if religions it should always be consistent, because in the moment when because in this chaos world where everything is inconsistent, in the chaos world like as in the chaos world in which like you don't have any grip and you need to have this certain grip, what you go is to religions, which is that religions are principally go for to being a consistent. We think that in the moment when we just going to that acknowledge, oh, there are new multi-interpretation, and we say yes, and certain, and later week again there are certain new interpretation, and we nodding to that every contest continuously and constantly to every interpretation that people going to propose. We think that it's going to loses the sanctity, how that the church is something that always stay original. What's the harm on this? We say the harm is that we're going to lose the conservative followers. We say the followers that always stick and latch onto this idea that church is something that can be trust on, that can be something to be interpreted. They say like these followers who donate to this church because who are like they become missionaries, or they the one who going to further away the area of the Christian church. We think that they are the devoted followers that need to be catered at the end of the day. We think that in the moment when they see how that the church currently is not something that they can grip on at the end of the day, they and something that they already been subscribed to and simply don't want to be original, we think that that's going to be lost. But when they say that, oh, we think that as if like OG won't say, oh, like we think we need to cater to new followers, we think to cater to like LGBT followers, like what they said. We think that number might be very small significance. They say like LGBT followers wouldn't be that high amount in like certain in countries, or like even in like big countries like US or all of that, because much of the people, much of these people, perhaps at the end of the day, is not something that really religious identify, or not having a small high scale. But even if like they have a high scale, we think that they won't be as devoted as this person, like, because much of time like they go for this religion simply for validation that they are right, won't be like really that do the salvation, or really that give the donation to the church itself. But secondly, why that is bad to evolve? We think that in the moment when we're going to evolve, they're going to more demands to evolve every day constantly. This is bad because church are demand to always compromising every interpretation that happens at hands. We think that this bad. Imagine if you are church are going to have this to like just compromise that, oh, currently that you can marry you can divorce now, or like you always do going to compromise. We think that at when these are going to be happy, what's going to happen is that the Bible would be something just like a blank text that everyone can simply interpret, and like church, because they have this image that they are evolving, they need to cater this, they need to pander this. As church, we think that this bad because it's nonsense for religions to like simply just erase every main preaching of the Bible simply just to have this scattering of all interpretation. We think as church, we need to be a moral compass and stay original. Very proud to open the case of all.
Thank you very much to Professor. Deputy Prime Minister.
Yeah, wait there. Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
What you need to understand in this debate is that it needs to talk about specifically Christian church and why when changes happen eventually, because there's changes in the trend, or like how the world operates right now, for example, how they now do not like, like stoning people and do something like that, because that's illegal to begin with. We said that we need to have a strategy on explaining to people why we're still consistent and why changes eventually will happen, but why that means you're still a part of, like preaching towards God. You're still you're still ibadah to your God. That's the most important thing that Christian church needs to prioritize in this debate, right? Because changes will happen to begin with. And this debate needs to talk about the best outcome of what strategy Christian church will take in this debate, right? So opening oppositions cannot just run away by saying that, okay, we hate changes, but that's happening in the real world. How are you going to impact that? We think that most likely what's going to happen under opposition side of the house is the fact that they're not going to address this implicit, and they're going to address this very implicitly. There's not going to be very explicit. They do not like forum, or they do not like discussions that talk about this, because it means that they are acknowledging it like what the government wants in the status quo, ladies and gentlemen. We said that exactly because we have the ability to control people reactions. That's why learned characterizations matter, because Christian church, for example, is very different with other religious institutions, right? They're very, very, they do not have hierarchy like what happens in Catholic churches, for example. Therefore, there needs to be an effort as in religious organizations from the multiple leader to ensure that people accept the change, the effort that can only come when they come in and preachings on why this is consistent and this is relevant to what the teachings of religions will be to begin with. And that's why they're relevant, and that's why you still trust the religions, and you still needs to be part of the religions. We're consistent. That's why the only thing that makes people become loyal to religions, and people see religions as the enlightenment in their life, is when they're consistent, and when people are encouraging discussions about that, which is non-existent under opposition side of the house, right? Being consistent is the only way for you to do it. If you're not going to do that, because in comparison, you're not going to justify changes, making people guessing what is the decisions, the changes of when the changes of teachings exist, when they're in preaching sessions, for example. We said that this is harmful. Making people guessing is harmful because it makes them lose trust to religions, because they're easier for them to adopting religion's value, and it's easier for them to be affected by people outside of religion who talk shit about Christianity in general, right? Because they point out how inconsistent your preacher are, and how you do not have any logical reasons or any reasons why being inconsistent is acceptable as a religion, ladies and gentlemen. Exactly because of this, we say that it's important to maintain our loyal followers, the things that we need to prioritize the most, because they're the ones who are connected to our religions to begin with, right? We say that knowing that churches have, as Christian churches have a very different interpretations, for example, the interest of the leader is to ensure there's no bloodbath, for example, or no division between people who believe in Christianity, can only happen when we acknowledge that even when people have different interpretation, that's fine, because nobody is perfect. Being a follower of Christianity is not going to make you perfect, but aiming to always striving for perfection or changing the way you behave, because it's going to make God, make you devote to God even more. That's what we're trying to prove in this debate, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why the only way we could make churches, Christian churches, even with different interpretations, not being hostile to each other or being hostile to people outside Christian churches, makes them less relevant, is when they're able to do this and able to ensure that people are going to be by the changes to begin, right? So we think that in this debate, OO cannot just talk about, or opposition bench can talk about on how that old interpretations is good, because what happened in the status quo right now, right, is changing. The only explanations that come from their side of the house is they're going to lose sanctity, and that's bad because it's going to devote followers, it's going to affect devoting followers and will abandon them. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, sanctity isn't gonna, first of all, we say that the sanctity that we're talking about and needs to be prioritized and unchangeable in Christianity is sanctity that are very specific, like 10 commandments. We're talking about you cannot muka dua in God, for example, or you cannot disrespectful to your father and to your mother. Those are the core identity that we're still going to preserve. But other interpretations of how you daily basis are going to act as a Christianity is very interchangeable and dependent on what current law exists, for examples. What are we talking about? We're talking about, for example, interpretations like an eye for an eye, which means that you have to kill if you get killed, for examples, or stoning prostitutes, or banning clothes with different fabric that have no explanations or no logical reasons why that can be done right now. It might have logical explanation in the past, but this situation is very different right now, right? In the conclusions, changes is inevitable, ladies and gentlemen, because if you're still going to stone prostitute, you're going to be charged with criminal, and then you are unable to operate as a Christian church to begin with, because you're seen as a very hateful religious organizations that are hateful to like other minority community, for example. We're living in an era where people are very woke, people are very FJW. In order for you to stay relevant is to ensure that consistency is to ensure that changes will be acceptable by your followers, ladies and gentlemen. In order for you to attract new followers, so they do not see religious as being exclusive to people who are straight, to people who are, who are like white people. They are being defined a lot with the previous teaching to begin with. We said that in order for you to take care or to at least make sure that people believe in this is to become to change the way you behave, and in order for you to make sure that your loyal followers are not going to turn your back against you, is by having conversations and making sure and acknowledging this openly, in order to make sure that people are not going to have misinterpretations of what changes exist to begin with, right? We said that was losing under opposition side of the house, no matter how different or like how they're going to, because most likely what they're going to do is they're going to wait until people accept their transitions without questioning. But that's not true, right? Because a lot of this is very, very personal towards them. It's how they're connected to their God. If they feel like the preachers are not being consistent, and because there are no conversations, they feel like losing sanctity because there are no logical reasons exactly in opposition side of the house, most likely they're going to question and not going to follow these religions to begin with. the interest of the religious community is going to be lessened under their side of the house because people are questioning your credibility as a religion, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why it's so unstrategic under their side of the house, right? But we also told you that people will buy our reasonings because they believe with the religious leader. The fact that you're a figure of authority, the moment you open conversations, most likely they're going to be bought upon by your explanations because your approach is going to be emotional. It's going to emotional sermon that told you why this is consistent. People who only trust you to begin with, ladies and gentlemen, it's much more believable in comparison to forum outside religions that we do not have control, whether it's true or not, or whether it's going to connect with people or not. We're the only one that exclusively can give you that to propose.
Okay, thank you very much for Deputy Prime Minister to close the debate in opening house. Please welcome Deputy Leader Opposition.
Kak, tadi aku belum sempat ke toiletnya. May I just go now, just 1 minute? Soalnya tadi kan jadi novel. Is it okay?
Halo. Okay, can you repeat? Tadi agak putus.
Oh maaf Kak,
Kenapa?
tadi aku nggak sempat ke toiletnya, kan tadi kan nyari novel. Can you just go now for like 1 minute to balik?
Okay, please be fast.
Okay.
Ya.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. I'm gonna start my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2. I think that to answer is why are they side government needs to answer is why are they consistent at all, right? Because you're basically admitting that on your side that Christian churches has been wrong before in the past. The fact that they've been wrong in how they portray Jesus, how they interpret the holy scripture of Bible, for example, right? But it also elicits a possibility that they are also wrong in the future to begin with, right? We understand that why would suddenly on government people would get that solvency that they get in the to begin with, right? Because just two responses to open up my speech, right? Number one, when they say that we're going to be seen as inconsistent opposition, right? We don't think that there's going to be that much fracture and infighting on our side to begin with, right? Because understand that on our side, people are going to be indoctrinated, right? Because if government wants to claim that people are going to believe our sermons and so on and so forth, then I guess it applies to us too, that most likely people are also going to believe that that the fact that there's not that much changes to begin with, right? This is when Naufel's context comes in and become important, because understand that precedents in the past, the reason why, for example, we change our that match of interpretation to begin with is because there is a huge threat. The fact that there are Romans, for example, crucifying our followers, attacking us to begin with. So there is a major urgency for you to change and manage to come to those people in the end of the day, right? In status quo, we say that there's not that much stress to begin with. I'm just going to, do one extension. I'm going to tell to you why it's not the Christian church interest to actually recognize with two different layers on a personal level and on the communal level. So let's begin, right? We agree that the interest of Christian church is to have that much followers to begin with, right? You have to keep the sanctity of the church, Bible, and everything to have that conservative feeling. But why is this important? Two things. Number one, I think that most likely understand understand that the reason why currently that the Christian church is able to gain this much followers and this much understanding is because we think that there's a current mysticism in how the church operates, right? That the church, for example, says that Bible is the words of God that is original to begin with. Or number two, for example, the lessons that's given to church are two teachings given by Jesus to begin with, right? But secondly, we think many of our followers have prided and followed this religion and dogma for years, not knowing it has ever changed before to begin with. What does this mean? This means that most likely we say that sanctity of the church has always been something that's been the interest of church to begin with. The fact that they want to keep it for their followers to protect it to a higher level, for example, because that's what they've been doing since the past to begin with, right? We see that those are the things that there's been always been presented by the church, for example, right? The problem with side government is that they're comparative, is that they most likely they're going to pander to too many different interpretations. This means that when they say about fracture, for example, there's going to be like clashes between those different interpretations, right? Most likely they're going to attack one another also. We don't see why the harm of misinterpretation is also on us of the house, because understand that the moment when you are still like assuming the fact that they are saying that other interpretation are right, it means that you are giving liberty to other people to also follow the bad teachings. For example, the fact that they want to attack people to attack LGBTQ, for example, those are still going to happen on your side to begin with, right? Understand that governments of the house, what happens is that when you are breaking this illusion, it becomes a concession that the religion is something that is not that holy because it has been tampered with, changed by people in their need to begin with, right? And government, they would keep on demanding for them to be changes. This is bad. Why? Because firstly, let's address on a personal level, right? Because understand that in status quo right now, there's a huge number of conservative followers who's always followed the dogmas, right? Because they've always followed what we've said from beginning, right? The moment on governments of the house, we dispute their claim that they can control the narrative. Because understand that on your side, you are going to concede that there are many different interpretations, and that is right, for example. The problem is right now, right? There's a spectrum of how people are being conservative and being, liberal to begin with, because on their side they blanketly assume that people are going to automatically adopt more progressive values to begin with, right? The problem with this right now is that there are also those people who are also going to question, was the past teaching the one that's right, or we just the one that changed it to fulfill what our needs back then? For example, what this means, most likely people are going to be interpreted as bad too. This is going to be create a bad discussion. It's going to give legitimacy to even more bad interpretation to begin with, right? Especially for vulnerable actors, for example, those people who are in need of solace, like what Naufal said, these people who doesn't want their faith to be shaken, for example, because understand in status quo, the reason why they are staying and having hope with the church is because they understand that no matter what people say, that for example, the leaders are right, our sermons were right, we're given that little ability to feel happy with ourselves, exactly because no one understands religion as much as us, for example, even when we're attacked. On-site government, what you're going to allow is that you're going to make them think, are these attacks right? Am I just following a social construction to begin with that has no actual liability to begin with, right? What this means is that number one, these people will not get the closure they need. And they're going to question themselves, am I praying to the right interpretation of Jesus? Have I been defiling his image by joining a new interpretation later, yeah? And a new religion to begin with, right? Most likely what they're going to feel is that they're going to feel hopeless, for example. This is bad because you have to understand that there's always been those people who are inherently hopeless and in need of the Christian church, for example, right? The fact that they're the one who is hopeless, for example, who cannot delineate between these kinds of different teachings, for example, the only way for them to gain comfort is by the consistency of church. The fact that they understand what they've been doing all this time is right. The fact that they enter the church, for example, they pray the way that they've been taught to pray, for example. Those kinds of things are the only things that actually give them comfort to begin with, to make them happy, to give them that little solace in this capitalistic world that just screws you up over and over and over again, for example, right? Because understand that on government, then what happens to begin with, right? We say that what's going to happen is that these poor people, these single moms, are going to start questioning if they're not getting their lottery, their benefits that they want, right? Are they actually doing the right things? And we say that that damages the church. What does this lead to? Second layer, communal level. You're going to lose followers because number one, conservative followers, I've explained, would most likely be fractured because they feel that the Christian church screwed up, and then you're going to allow other people to enter in and come to the interpretation. But number two, most likely these moderate people would lose that sense of mysticism to our religion, right? They're going to live and opt into other religion that they see as consistent, for example, that gives them answer. Because understand that most people enter religion not only gain that pandemic, but they seek to see answer, a huge one answer, one right answer, for example. The problem with that doesn't happen inside government, because you're saying to them that there are many right answers and we could be wrong too. You're evaluating the authority that you want to begin with. That's the problem. What's the comparative in a position? The comparative is simple. We will still have these kinds of major, only one big interpretation. We're going to say to you that there's only one interpretation, only us as the Christian church to follow, which things at least will give a better consistency to how the religion operates, how the people inside see one another. The fact that there's going to be fracture, we can easily just meddle and say that, oh, those people are golongan kesat, for example. Those are the benefits that we can offer, because on government, what they're actually doing is just resolving that mysticism. We see that it's a benefit that opposition, that government, the consistency.
Okay, thank you very much for the position. To open the debate in closing half, please welcome government member.
Please give me several minutes to arrange my paper.
Okay.
Oh yeah, for POI, please just write it in the chat box because I'm going to check the chat box. I'm going to start my speech. Oh wait, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Sorry, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Yes, you're audible. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, the entire case of team opening government is that they centralize their argumentation based on the idea that there will be a clarity that exists between this Christianity church at the end of the day, right? But the problem with this is that it's not necessarily an exclusive thing, right? Because even in both sides of the house, ladies and gentlemen, there is always a clarification happen regardless in both sides of the house, right? There is always, for example, pastor or even your parents that you can always refer to, right? I think this is something that is not really exclusive is not really exclusive. But number two, how will CG enter the debate, right? CG will enter the debate. We are going to explain to you, for example, why the idea of recognizing the dogma's thought, how it's different from what it was in the past, ladies and gentlemen, will be able to show and also promote the individual contentment that will be achieved better under closing government of the house. And second, I'm going to tell you about the principal justification and why it will further push our followers to continue the fight on Christian church in the Rome Empire. I'm going to extend this in my point of contribution, right? But before that, independent rebuttal towards opening opposition, ladies and gentlemen. Mostly they talk about the sanctity of church, right? But the biggest problem that opening opposition never explained is that, number one, what is sanctity of churches that they mean at the end of the day, right? Who will determine the right and wrong under their side of the house? Because we say we are not going to, for example, disrupt the sanctity of church at the end of the day, because under closing the government of the house, we are not going, it won't lose because we do not, for example, change the core value of Christianity, ladies and gentlemen. We just, for example, recognize that the dogmas in the past might be different and want to promote in the current context of societal structure, ladies and gentlemen, right? I think this is something that opening opposition, opening opposition forget, ladies and gentlemen, right? But number two, I think that the right or wrong, ladies and gentlemen, in this word is not absolute, right? It's socially constructed by the people, right? I think the parameter of morality, for example, can also be compromised and adjusted based on the changing of environment, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, never explain to you why compromises is necessarily a bad thing, ladies and gentlemen, right? Because, like, for example, just because we compromise does not necessarily mean they hate us. Muslim terminating kafir, for example, is not a compromisable verse. But the first is controversial because it backclasses the human right, the universal principle that we agreed upon, ladies and gentlemen, right? Even if, for example, it is not compromisable under Muslims, for example, yet this creates controversy that leads to the narrative how Muslim is always be associated with terrorism because they justify killing at the end of the day, right? So we do not necessarily think that compromises your old value with the counter score is not necessarily something that is bad. Two contributions under closing government. Number one, I'm going to talk about how will this allow individuals to have more access towards containment. Number two, I'm going to talk about principle level to respect Jesus as a figure of revolution, ladies and gentlemen. Context. What does Christian church do in the current status quo that never been contextualized in opening government is that they glamorize a figure of Jesus, they glorify a figure of Jesus Christ to be as loving and as care as possible to its surrounding, ladies and gentlemen, right? Under this kind of narrative in the current status quo, people are trapped to achieve this unrealistic standard, ladies and gentlemen. Under opposition, people can only be content if they succeed, for example, to fulfill the holy figure of Jesus that is always caring and loving, ladies and gentlemen, right? In the current context, where hardships exist everywhere, where capitalistic structure oppress people on a daily basis, ladies and gentlemen, sometimes we tend to be angry, we tend to be pissed, right? There is no way we can be loving when everything triggers us to be angry, ladies and gentlemen. If we recognize Jesus used to be angry to the king of Rome because Christian church is going to be monetized, ladies and gentlemen, whenever we feel angry in the current status quo, ladies and gentlemen, we do not have to be guilty, right? This when the idea of contentment under our side of the house, under this modern world, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be exist under our side of the house, right? I think this is important for individuals, right? Because sometimes individuals work themselves based on the religiosity of them getting closing to getting closing to their God, ladies and gentlemen, right? I think this is something that is very important for us to promote, ladies and gentlemen, right? Because the hardships that is faced by Jesus in this in the past, for example, ladies and gentlemen, might be the hardships that we, for example, possess in the current status quo, right? I think that I think, ladies and gentlemen, this is the reason why, in order for us to show the imperfection where Jesus sometimes can be angry and so on and so forth, is something that is allow individuals also to feel content about themselves, that it is actually okay to be angry and to have revolutions to fight against oppression, right? But number two, let's talk about the principle level to respect Jesus as a figure of revolution. Look, Jesus, I think the current problem in the status quo, Christian church always portray Jesus as a holy figure, right? As a loving figure to their followers. Jesus is more than just a loving figure. Jesus is a figure of revolution that liberate Christian church from further politicization or monetization, ladies and gentlemen, right? If we actively recognize or inform our followers, it means that we proactively tell that Jesus used to fight for this cause. This is important for our followers to adopt, ladies and gentlemen. Why? Because in the current status quo, in the current context, where in the vast majority of cases, religion might always be politicized, we need our people to liberate Christianity, church to be politicized, ladies and gentlemen, right? If we show how Jesus used to fight for this, ladies and gentlemen, in the past, that we glorify the revolutionary figure of Jesus Christ, for example, they might have more reasons to defend Christianity, church, from politicization and also monetization in the current status quo, ladies and gentlemen, right? Jesus as a figure, because why is it going to be successful, right? Why is it likely? Because Jesus as a figure, for example, have a charisma to its followers, ladies and gentlemen. Most likely they will join, right? Because they centralize their entire culture and habituation to undergo day-to-day basis activity, ladies and gentlemen, on the Christianity values, for example, right? I think that preserving Christian church will be much more sustainable under our side of the house, because we finally remember that Jesus used to fight for the liberation of Christian church from politicization and monetization, right? I think it's going to be better under our side of the house. But second, let's talk about the respect. We think that if we do not recognize like what happened in opening opposition, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to dismiss the blood and the sweats of Jesus and his soldiers, ladies and gentlemen, right? We say that it is not going to be justified, right? Especially when Jesus, for example, has already saved people to achieve humanity and so on and so forth, ladies and gentlemen. I think the idea of Christian church in the current status quo, ladies and gentlemen, need to imply how Jesus, for example, used to do this in the past, so that the fight of Jesus to free free and liberate Christian church to be monetized, like what happened in Rome Empire, ladies and gentlemen, to be continued by his followers in the current status quo, right? So this is the reason why closing government is going to take the debate, right? We do not care if we have more followers or not. At the very least, our followers can be able, for example, to fight and also to continue the fight of Jesus Christ to liberate Christian church from politicization and monetization. We are very proud to open the case of closing.
For government member to open the debate and closing opposition side, please welcome opposition member. Soraya.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, so I'm setting up my timer. Okay, arranging my chaotic paper. Okay, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 points of clarifications before I jump into my speech. Number one, it's very funny when opening government says that, oh, there should be no hierarchy in Christianity. We want an open interpretation, but at the same time, they want their narrative to be the dominant one in Christianity. Like, if you want to be true Christian, you have to denounce the past teachings, you have to allow gays inside the church and whatnot. And we believe that is already backlashing their own stance. So OG's mechanism cannot fly in this debate by principle, right? But okay, second, to clarify our identity in this debate, all only preach that, oh, there's one rule and one dogma, and we're going to champion uniformity and whatnot, right? But we believe that no, that is going to be Catholicism. Under CO, we're exactly going to explain to you why Christianity should be open and no one should denounce anything and nothing should be said as the one true narrative of Christianity, right? Meaning that we're not going to do any call outs on the past or existing interpretations, and we want to maintain peace in Christianity. Okay, third, I'm going to explain 2 things. Number one, I'm going to explain the value of Christianity and why there's no urgency for you to actually clear up any kind of narrative. Number two, I'm going to talk about rising conflict and tension in religion if you suddenly open up this kind of debate, right? So I'm going to intertwine my rebuttals, but yeah, OG's benefit of inclusivity and CG's benefit of personal contentment. I'm going to explain why those 2 things are still going to exist on our side of the house, right? Okay, first argument, talking about the value of Christianity and why there's no urgency for you to actually change anything, right? The new characterization that's going to be brought by CO in this debate is, number one, we're going to explain to you how Christianity already allows different interpretations, right? Christianity was born on the anti-classism of Catholicism in the first place, hence the name Protestant, right? And now there's already a different variety of Christianity. There's Lutheran, there's Mormon, Jehovah, Amish, Calvinist, charismatic, and whatnot, right? What is the point of me naming all of these things? Because it announces government's urgency, right? Because both of the people who believe in the old ways and the new ways can be catered in this kind of diversification of interpretation of Christianity at the end of the day. Like the Amish still believes that circumcision should be mandatory, and like some churches who are progressive, like charismatic, already accept gays into the churches. And like all of the things like OG brought, like stoning and whatnot, it's not a matter of debate exactly because they say, one, it's illegal, and number two, the New Testament already blocks that. So yeah, that explanation already negates OG's point about inclusivity and CG's point of personal contentment, because this Christianity, this form of Christianity has already a place for everyone, right? So the value of Christianity is the freedom of expression under one umbrella, which is Christianity, and one dogma, which is the Bible, right? Now, what is the narrative of OG and why does it challenge all of these things? Because when you denounce something as wrong, you don't only denounce the past teachings, but you also denounce the current teachings of the Amish, the current teachings of conservative churches that still believe in these things. These are, number one, not inherently in line with the value of Christianity in the first place, which we don't want one authority, but then you're antagonizing different churches as well. And it's going to escalate into rising conflict between churches at the end of the day, which brings me nicely to my second point, explaining to you why the rising conflict is exactly likely and why there's going to be tension in religion, right? OO already talked to you a little bit about how, oh, this is going to be backlash, but they only explain it in like the general term of religion. They don't exactly bring the context of Christianity, which is exactly why we're going to bring you more like detailed and complicated analysis on this, right? Okay, what's the difference between our stance and the government bench, right? Now, we believe that Christianity is open or interpretation under one general guideline, which is the Bible, right? So the Bible is the number one dogma that we say has not changed. But what we disagree with on government side of the house is that they say that the Bible should be interpreted this way and the old way is wrong, right? This is what we challenge on the government side of the bench. We believe that all other interpretations can also be accepted in the Christian identity. It's just that the one dogma that has not changed and will never change is exactly the Bible. Now, practicality. What will happen the moment you denounce this interpretation as wrong, right? We believe that automatically, of course, there's going to be backlash from other segmentations of Christianity, like I explained earlier, on how Amish still believe that circumcision is still a rule and whatnot, right? And what OG did not explain to you is that why, just because you suddenly clarify that the old ways are wrong, why then the people on the ground will automatically believe you and not have any sort of backlash and whatsoever, right? Now, let me give you this picturization of the flow of the discourse that's going to happen, right, on the government side of the house. Okay, sure. When you start off, you only challenge about on how you don't need to circumcise anymore. But then it's going to escalate. Then how should you sing in church? How should you collect persembahan? Is bahasa roh in charismatic church right or wrong? How should we have marriage ceremony, right? This kind of debate will always escalate. And eventually you're going to touch on the more sensitive issues, such as like, should we have gay people in church or not, right? This is exactly bad, because then there's going to be this very, very open debate of what Christianity should be in the world. And that's exactly what we don't want to happen under closing opposition, right? Because the output of this argument is that no matter how small the discussion you start, it will always escalate into chaos, right? Because this is only going to be another argument of Sunni versus Shia, which religious value is going to be true, which religious value is going to be wrong, right? So the output of this argument is that you're going to lose the peace in Christianity. What is the comparative on our side of the house? On outside of the house, under the mechanism of we're not going to say anything about anyone else's interpretation, we're only going to have the peace and like good ibadah on our own churches without commenting on anything else. But the thing that binds us together as Christians is our open love for the Bible, right? We're not going to have any sort of discussion on what is the true way of ibadah, what is the true value of Christianity. We believe that the dogma has been the same and will always be the same, and anyone from like any sort of identity will be accepted in one of the segmentations, right? If you like loud ibadah, you can go to charismatic. If you like chill ibadah, you can go to Lutheran or Calvinist, for example. If you believe that you should still like do circumcision, you're open to do that under like Amish, or like you can do that anyway, right? We're not going to tell you that it's wrong, but under government side of the house, they're going to dictate all of these things. They're going to say that this is wrong, this is right, this is what you should believe in, and that is exactly what we don't want under side closing opposition. We're very
Okay, thank you very much for closing opposition. To close the debate in government side, please welcome government web.
Sorry, gue boleh minta waktu 1 atau 2 menit buat ke toilet bentar nggak ya?
Please be fast ya.
Oke.
I mean nggak bisa ditahan lagi ya?
Iya.
Oh ya dah.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the sides of opening opposition And both closing opposition should not win above closing government, as their entire arguments revolve around the idea that the people will not be able to see new and old interpretations, right? As if they're a frog in the well, devoid of any knowledge of such informations. This is fact because this is very dismissive to the entire cases that the government team has brought. They are not representative, as I don't think that people will be that dumb. People will be able to search these new interpretations even on the internet, even in the new access of such knowledge that are so accessible in the current status quo. It is impossible for them to just go with such an utopic and ideal world that the opposition both has provided, right? Closing government provide you with with an realistic portrayal that we are going to address even when people are able to understand that they access such information in the internet, when it has become a discussion within your own church member, within your own Christianity members. I think that's why we should still address that. I think that this is more important than the entire opposition benches, right? Second, opening government cannot topple the closing government. Why is that the case? Because I don't think that what the opening government proposed and contribute were actually truly that relevant, right? Yes, they are great at identifying the problems, right? Because of course that is Leon. But we think that at best their benefits is only abstract because they see that we need to provide a clarity, that there must be some kind of guidance from the church to lead the people to actually be able to understand what is truly right or wrong, right? I don't think that this is an exclusive benefits, right? Because at best, I don't think that you should also establish and what is the right perceivement and what is the right values for the world and religion, exactly because the religion is a personal. You should believe what you believe, but this is how the church are going to interpret it and what is the new available information that access and how you should research to your steps, right? That is why currently contributions become much more valuable. Why is that the case? Because we provide you with the tangible benefits that are immediately impacts you in the very short run. We are addressing those spectrums where people will see this as a method to proliferate this kind of knowledge, where people will access this knowledge, where now every people in the world, every Christianity in the world will realize this Jesus. They are going to be motivated by such kind of willingness for Jesus to be able to revolutionize the entirety of the system of these new particular things, right? They're going to be inspired exactly because they're now gaining such knowledge that did not exist in the current status quo. I think that this is better at the very least, right? Yes, we're going to provide a new interpretations. We're going to also glorify that, but this new information that access a new doctrine will allow people, common people, to access this kind of information, right? Two questions to the entire opposition cases, right? Number one, opening opposition told you that there exists numerous amounts of demands to change constantly, right? First, I don't think that this is true. We refuse to accept or premise that religion will simply become a blank book. Note that in changing the dogmas, what we are only going to change is the interpretation of particular clauses in the Bible. Bible still exists. Therefore, the basic values of Christianity explicitly stated within the Bible will not change at all. What they explain to you and the example that they give to you will truly not change, such as allowing people and allowing couple to divorce now will still not be able to be allowed in the Christianity in general, exactly because it is directly prohibited by the Bible. Polygamy, in what established in the Ten Commandments, it also will not be entertained exactly because it is contradicting against the existing Bible. I don't think that there will be such amount of changes exactly of that, right? That's the extent of changes that happen in the status quo. People will not suddenly just promises and requires a new of forms of interpretation and numerous amounts of demands to be accessed in the very first place because they realize the extent of what can they actually demand, right? Second, exactly of their contribution themselves, that people are loving the consistency, right? If the people are truly loving the consistency, I don't think that it is more likely for them to actually change this, especially when there exists the interpretation right now in the current status quo that is accessible for everyone. But even if, for example, exists many demands to change, would they never told you why is that harmful? Number one, just because access numbers demands does not mean that it will be accepted 100% immediately, right? This is all. There will also exist people who uphold the present interpretation, who will make demands to maintain the status quo and will not change at all. Therefore, this creates a perfect check and balance that there will be, and I think that there's no manifestation of harm coming from opening opposition. Second, I think that it is far worse and far better in our side of the house, exactly now because we're going to allow a constructive discussion within the society. We're going to legitimize the discussion that change is allowed. Therefore, those conservative people that originally do not want to abide at all, do not want to change their perspective at all, now has the incentive that maybe it is possible for our values to actually change following the demand of the society. You're creating an incentive and you're creating and allowing them to actually change because of their own perspective, right? People will feel that people are going to be able to debate and argue whether new interpretation is actually needed or not. There exists a platform that you can utilize only exclusive in our side of the house, right? People will feel like they're included in the establishment of the interpretation, as now the conservative are going to be able to be granted platform to realize the concern that was coming from those progressive, right? I think that this is better in our side of the house. Lastly, let's discuss about losing followers, right? Just for the sake of engagement. Number one, they told you that people are going to switch to another religion. First, they need to prove to you why is it that easy for people to simply switch that religion, right? I don't think that it is likely. Number one, we think that most of the time you're going to be personally attached towards the God because they have to give you a salvation for you, for example, right? That they have given you so much kindness, that is why you create an emotional attachment towards your God. Therefore, even if you do not believe in the new interpretation, it is okay for you to just still believe in the religion, to still believe in the old God and in the God themselves, exactly because what you're perceiving is not only because the interpretation, but there access those kind of connection within you. We're not going to force them to believe. We're going to force that we're going to proliferate and give them education, right? It's going to give you more helpful towards the dub. Anyway, let's move on. Even if people will switch religion, right? I don't think that this is truly relevant. We'll take that bullet. Why? Because most likely those kind of people are not those people that are truly believing in Christianity. They're the ones that are truly agnostic and don't truly care about the existence of Christianity in the very first place, right? Lastly, they told, okay, sure, I'm not going to do that since it's already going to offer. But anyway, look, closing government is the only team who tell you the interest of the Christian church to not dismiss the contribution of Jesus, right? Jesus should not be limited to be just loving figure and but also revolutionary figure. That is the only way when you're going to proliferate such kind of knowledge, right? That has fighting, this Jesus has fight for the liberation of Christian church from monetization and politicization that are showing our people that Jesus sacrificed his life for this will make our people to also persevere Christian church to be free from monetization and prohibition, right? Second, we are the only team that do not dismiss Jesus' struggles as a revolutionary figures. The blood and sweat are recognized under CG. Very proud to win this debate.
Thank you very much. To close the entire debate, please welcome opposition whip.
Hi, so there is a big rain in my home, so am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, just setting up my timer. Oh yeah, for POI, just put it on chat and I will see it regularly if I have time. So, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think it's pretty clear that the one who can contextualize about the Christianity is only the closing opposition. Because in the opening opposition, they only talk about how then there is a one dogma, therefore there is no people are going to discuss about that. Therefore, you have like the strong one dogma that exists in those particular people. But then it is a Catholicism scenario in the opening opposition houses. But then the contrast, I think in closing opposition, we told to you how then under the context of Christianity, when you should not have any connection towards dogma, because that is how the people are going to believe that. So I think this kind of characterization is the most important and the most relevant one in the closing opposition benches. But then some clarification to clean up this debate a little bit. So I think the whole government benches have lack of those has lack of context about what is the difference about dogma and so interpretation. I don't think that is the same things, because intuitively the interpretation dogma is also beyond interpretation. That means dogma is something that the essence of the Bible. It is something different with the interpretation, because interpretation are made by people, but then the dogma is made by the God as by the God itself. Therefore, the BOP is not only to prove to you about whether it is justified for a human to actually change the interpretation, but their BOP is also higher than that. Number one, they need to prove to you about who are going to make this new dogma, and like how capable they are, or how they you going to like make a best policy ever. But second of all is that how then your people are going to know that this dogma is upper hand compared to another, and why then this dogma is actually the one truly true dogma. So I think those kind of confusion interpretation is actually not a Googleable things like what closing government said, because in the interpretation of you like try to searching one dogma to another. So I think that you need to also like you need to also have like exchange of knowledge about how that you're going to like preserving about your ideology in itself. But then we told to you that the essence of those Catholic those Christianity should be in a true interest. This is how web speaker. Number one is talking about the interest about to maintaining the purity of Christianity, and second of all is talking about the religion proselytization to create a peaceful religion effort in the closing opposition. But before that, I will like to contextualize about the flexibility that is being brought by the whole government benches. How then this flexibility to create protection towards minority or to protect the individual contentment, this all the benefit is uncertain. Why is that so? Because they rely on externalities. For example, opening government minority protection depend on the policy making on that axis. But the problem is, if you have so many diverse discussion about that, I'm not sure about which policy is actually certain and which policy are going to be manifest in OG houses. But then in closing government, their individual contentment is also contingent upon how individual believe on that. But we told to you that individual have different interpretation. That is the value of those Christianity anyway. But the problem here in the closing government house, you're going to like abandon those kind of people who actually like demand, who actually believe on the Old Testament, for example, because now there is a narrative that new dogma is a truly better dogma, and you need to follow that. So I think we need to fix that anyway. The first issue then, let's engage with the closing government talking about the unrealistic standard and how they will apprehend about that. So they told to us that we're not changing the core value, but we're only changing the interpretation. This is untrue, because if you change the interpretation, that means you're going to indirectly to change the way and the story or the Bible value. Therefore, this is the moment where the conflict escalate actions. I think the opening opposition tried to talk this in a little bit, but they never explain to you about what is the actual root conflict here. It's about root conflict here is about how do you go to debating a dogma, because dogma is not something undebatable, because they're talking about how do you go to resolve, how do you go to debating ayat, for example. So you don't have any you don't have any tipping point on those kind of situation. But moreover, let's engage with the closing government unrealistic standard to the individual contentment. I think this is unclear in government whether this brand new interpretation are not going to be that burdening towards the Christianity, because most likely someone who may reinterpret those value is people in power. For example, the leader of church. For example, they can interpret it in the negative way. For example, try to try to push people to pay a donation even more. For example, so I think those kind of on the contrast, if you stick in if you see in the core value of Christianity, I think you're not going to give some room for a leader to changing that regulation, because I think that is unstrategic for you to engage on that. But then lastly, they talk about how the people are going to uphold all dogma. Therefore, we're going to still have check and balance. That is what the extension of web speaker. So I think this is untrue, because if you're going to leave out those people because of this new dogma are going to be seen as the best as the best dogma, therefore you're going to leave out those kind of minority who want to uphold the old dogma. Therefore, those kind of check and balance that exist in government side of the house are not going to be wrong, because now you're going to dominate it by the one who make this new dogma and the one who make this new interpretation engage on that. But then in the second issue there, let's talking about how do you going to make interpretation is actually bad for those for the Christianity. We have idea about the interest of church is to do proselytization of dogma as pure as possible, because it is a God mandate anyway. But by principle, they don't have any authority to change the Bible. But how then talking about the OG interest about changing behavior? I think this is unlikely, because if you open interpretation, that means you're going to give justification for people to behave about new behavior that they prefer to. Why then this is important? Because if there is so many interpretation, for example, the way people are going to behave will be different anyway. And that's why the idea about competition to show that my interpretation is the most correct one are going to be accessed. That's how you're going to have. That's why it is really harmful for the church, because now if the conflict occur, it's going to make people are hesitate to join your church, church, and even you first, and even the church itself are going to force people to actually follow your rule. So I think this is really not this is really not reliable for those people. But the second point is that about what happened if you have so many dogma on this in the house. That means you're going to follow like kind of hard to find out which dogma is actually true, because people need to find out which interpretation is the best interpretation. Why this is harmful? Because you're going to lose trust towards people, because now you're really open to so many interpretation where this is dissatisfied people who search to the purity of religion. That most likely these people who want to search for purity of religion is the one who allow loyal followers, for example. So you cannot lose that on the opening on the government houses. But then in the last context, then let's talking about how then in the misinterpretation are going to be worsened in the whole government pages, because they only explain about how the people are going to repair that, but there is no guarantee that those people is actually capable enough, or there's no guarantee that those interpretation is actually really true, or are going to be like helping the minority, for example. But on the contrast, if you stay if you stay in the purity of those religion, so I think that's good, because we're not going to join into the ultra conservative mindset, because there is a self-correcting mechanism for you to make rules which is in line with the real dogma, but also cater to the current demands. Therefore, the conclusion is that if you want to have if you have to have a peaceful religion, what you need to do as a church is that not force people to actually join into one interpretation or two interpretation, but you need to also give them freedom actually to choose to stick in the dogma that they want to believe to, because the more important here is about the purity of those religion, because if not, you're going to be failed as a religious presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for position whip. Thank you so much for all the debater. That's all for the debate. You can go back to the main hall where the judge are going to discuss what the result.